Welcome to Relay Chain, a podcast produced by Parity Technologies where we discuss all things Substrate, Polkadot, and Web3. Today on Relay Chain, we have Derek Yoo from Moonbeam. Welcome to the show. Can you do a quick introduction of yourself?
Yeah, thanks for having me, Joe. Happy to do a quick intro. So, my background really is, just been building software as a service, kind of cloud technology companies my whole career. Started back in even the first internet wave back in the late '90s, and notably back in 2006, started a company called Fuse, and I worked there for a good long time. So I was there for about 12, 13 years. Building up that company before starting PureStake last year. And, that grew to be a pretty sizable company. So, at the time I left, that was a, 700 person company, $150 million run rate, enterprise focused cloud business. So, kind of have this, I think spent most of my career kind of in the Web 2, just kind of traditional cloud space. And, it's been interesting kind of coming into the Web 3 space because there are, definitely, some substantive differences. I think the story is my co-founder at that company, a guy named Steve Kokinos. So it was he and I that started that company back in 2006. He had left to start another company in the crypto space, and it's really through conversations with him that I kind of got into crypto and really started going down the rabbit hole. So he's now the CEO of a project called Algorand. Which is also based in Boston, kind of where we are. So that's kind of how I, initially kind of got interested. So, pretty recently, I guess, but, kind of knew I had to do something in the space, and kind of that's what led to starting PureStake.
Yeah, that's interesting because we see so many people that kind of especially in a young industry that's like a startup, very startup focused. A lot of people kind of jump 1 year here, 1 year there. And I know I think you said 16 or 17 years at that company.
13 years.
13, sorry.
Years.
I spent 6 years at a previous job, and sometimes I feel like that was a super long time. I guess my first question is so Moonbeam fills a need for a lot of user groups. And I guess how did that experience help you see the bigger picture and recognize this opportunity? Because I know that kind of experience can really inform seeing the bigger picture.
Yeah, many thoughts here, but I think this experience of kind of growing a company from kind of two of us to what became kind of a 700 person company, it's like many companies along the way. Sometimes I call it kind of like a book of many chapters, right? So when you're kind of just starting out, there's kind of one set of challenges you have, and one set of things I think that are the main things that are important to focus on. And then as the company grows, those things change, and even some of the skills need to change, right? As you get bigger, right? It's more about kind of managing people, managing teams, and how do you understand kind of what's happening at this larger scale. But for me, it's kind of in this early stage, the most critical thing is just to really focus on who's going to use your product and kind of what features that product, should have, and just make sure that, you kind of are building something that people want, right? And I think this kind of interaction with actual users is extremely critical, right? So that's definitely one lesson I've seen, is that if you develop too much without kind of interacting with who's actually going to be your customer or your user, that can definitely be problematic, because there's all sorts of assumptions you make. In the business we started, this was in the kind of cloud communication space. You always have some model in mind or some idea, and then we made a bunch of assumptions. Several of those just turned out to be wrong, right? It wasn't obvious until we kind of, we're a little bit down the line to say, we thought that internet bandwidth was going to be of this level of quality, and it wasn't, right? And then we had to kind of change a whole bunch about our model, and changed the business substantially. So I think that those learnings you can't really get to until you're actually engaging with people and trying these things out. So that's definitely one lesson. The other lesson I would say that is something much subtler that, is extremely important to me now, but, was definitely learning, is this whole thing just about having the right culture and having the right, just establishing the right culture and kind of this, how people interact and the kind of people that you hire. And it's kind of obvious, in the one hand, you want to, hire great people and, skilled people and people that you like to be around. But this cultural thing, I mean, I think that's where, if you had asked me back then, I'd say, well, company culture and values, and it seems kind of like big company-ish, right? It's like a poster on like a cubicle wall or something, and like, we don't need that. But you realize it actually is pretty important. And if you don't kind of talk about that and kind of, really emphasize that in your hiring practices and make sure everyone's on the same page, it ends up kind of drifting over time, and it leads to like problems. It leads to like big problems as you get bigger. So that's something I'm pretty tuned into and conscious of, based on that experience that I had before.
Yeah, I've heard of some like bigger Silicon Valley companies where the CEOs have said that they interviewed like personally their first like 400 employees before they pass that off to like other departments or whatever.
Yeah. I think my co-founder Steve did that, but at some point it was like 6 interviews in an hour. It's like 7 minutes each. It's like, well, I'm not sure you're actually getting to know these people, but yeah, I think I think that's that is definitely part of that same spirit, right? Of just wanting to be connected and kind of knowing that people are on the same page and you're creating the right culture.
Yeah, so like within the crypto space, like bridging like Polkadot, Ethereum, and all these tools that are around Ethereum, how did you just recognize this gap that was sitting between them all?
Yeah, well, maybe just for context, I just want to explain a little bit of what kind of the concept of Moonbeam is. So, Moonbeam is planned to be a parachain on both Kusama and on Polkadot. That's perhaps something else that we could talk about, the fact that we're doing on both. But the idea is that it's an Ethereum-compatible smart contracts parachain, and we're really striving for, from an initial feature set, we really want to strive for as close to full Ethereum compatibility as possible. So the question is why that feature set? Few reasons. I mean, I think one reason is it kind of, back to that original point, it gives us like a very tangible kind of audience and set of users to start engaging with, that are familiar with that technology stack, or they're using those development tools. There's existing projects, right, that have existing code bases that give us a set of candidates we can go talk to about deploying onto Moonbeam and giving us feedback. So I think that's definitely is part of the attraction. But I think on the other hand, it's like, even if you kind of take this more Polkadot centric approach, I mean, Substrate obviously is awesome development framework. We're using it ourselves to implement Moonbeam, gives lots of choices, but this whole kind of Ethereum dev stack is another set of tools that give another set of choices. So we feel we can kind of provide another set of choices basically to developers just when they're trying to solve their problems. And there are quite a bit of things from that existing Ethereum ecosystem that are potentially useful. I mean, there's whole teams that have spent all their time trying to focus on particular problems in UX or in other areas that I think it's kind of like nice to be able to leverage those solutions, like, or give those options basically.
Yeah, so like you implemented the full EVM, but a lot of other projects have done that, and like including on Parity Substrate, like we have an EVM module. But can you talk about like why that's not enough on its own? Why like just having the runtime implementation doesn't actually make something compatible with the existing ecosystem?
I mean, I'd first make the point that we are, of course, like leveraging Substrate and a bunch of the Ethereum compatibility components that are in Substrate, or there is another project called Frontier that's kind of closely related to Substrate. So, I mean, it's definitely, for our project, it's definitely kind of a case of standing on the shoulders of giants. I mean, I think everyone building a parachain is in the sense of Substrate, but I think even, we're kind of doubly so because there's a bunch of existing Ethereum compatibility functionality, that exists, in and around like the Substrate framework, which we're leveraging. One of them, as you mentioned, is this EVM frame palette that implements, a full, EVM compatible state transition engine. So that's all stuff that we're kind of leveraging in Moonbeam. I think what we found is that, and when we started looking at these components, is that there definitely were some missing pieces to make for a kind of a complete solution, right? One of the critical missing pieces was basically a Web3 RPC layer. So you have this EVM implementation. It can help provide Ethereum compatible state transitions. But in order for let's say an existing front end app, they're all using basically like the Web3 RPC mechanism, right? If you take an existing Ethereum application, and but a Substrate node only speaks Substrate, right? It has a separate Substrate RPC. So that is definitely was one missing element that we knew was needed, was the ability to kind of emulate or kind of provide this Web3 compatible RPC so that existing tools and existing applications could connect to, substrate based nodes and, access, this EVM state transition function. So, that's one thing we're just wrapping up a grant right now that we got from Web3 Foundation to implement this, this RPC layer. That work is actually happening in the Frontier project. It's actually outside of Moonbeam, but we're pulling it into Moonbeam. That's just one example of things. I would say that, that's on the tech side, but part of our also broader view is that, there's still just a huge lack of just kind of like educational materials. So, a big part of what we're trying to do too is basically create, tutorials, guides, videos, and other kinds of educational materials that above and beyond like the technical implementation and feature set, to help with adoption, right? To help developers understand how to use these components.
Yeah, that's super important. And I actually just watched the demo that you did, I guess last week while we're recording this. Who knows how long ago when we released it, but like when you started a Substrate node for Moonbeam and then like connected MetaMask to it. And that was like fucking cool, basically. Something we haven't seen before.
Yeah. I think it is, I would again say though, it's the power of Substrate is definitely like part of the magic here. I mean, and not to like go down like a path here, but I'd say that I think people don't appreciate like how powerful like a framework like Substrate is to create an effect like that, right? I mean, it's, because we've worked with some teams that have been building blockchains from scratch. And, that's a 20, 30 person engineering effort. Well, I mean, I guess just take Parity themselves, right? So like, working for 3 years, with, I don't know how many people, probably 30 engineers, probably over the, on average over the course of that time. I mean, it's just a pretty big effort. And, it's just a dramatic difference when you use a framework like Substrate to, to kind of implement your project.
Yeah. I mean, that's what we're going for. So I think it's getting there. So like when you talk about compatibility, like, there's connecting to the normal RPC stuff and having the runtime, but we also talk about bridges in Polkadot. And so could you talk about the difference between Moonbeam and a Polkadot Ethereum bridge? Is a bridge like part of Moonbeam or is it something else entirely?
Yeah. I would say that, we want to focus on the smart contract like implementation and kind of the place where developers would develop code. The bridging component does turn out to be critical for our use case, and this is feedback we've started to get from projects that we're working with. So yeah, I'll digress first before kind of directly answering the question. So, a lot of the projects that we approached, the dialogue is not, hey, like take your entire thing from Ethereum and move it to Moonbeam and leave Ethereum behind. That's just not like a practical option for like most projects. I mean, a lot of them are DeFi oriented and they may have dependencies on other projects within the Ethereum virtual machine that they're composing with. And just in general, I think for a lot of their use cases, they want to be on Ethereum because that's where there's a lot of liquidity and that's where they can access these other services. So the discussion is less about moving all the way, but more about, how can we kind of extend ourselves or how can we take advantage of Moonbeam? How can we move some of our workloads like to Moonbeam, but like leave our footprint on Ethereum? So kind of you end up in this discussion where there's kind of like a hybrid deployment, because they do have some problems, right? So I think that, end user gas fees is like a big problem for a lot of projects where, especially even ones that aren't financial oriented, when let's say like a game or something and, rolling the dice costs like $1 plus. So that's kind of problematic, right? For some of these use cases. So, what's clear to us is this kind of hybrid deployment is kind of going to be one of the key kinds of deployment scenarios to support. And in a hybrid deployment scenario, then the bridge becomes quite important, right? Because so then you have kind of your, some footprint or base on Ethereum mainnet, and then you have some, let's say, footprint on Moonbeam. How do you connect the two, right? And so that's where the bridge is definitely an important piece. I think part of our attraction to Polkadot is just this ability for different chains to like leverage each other's specialized services. So in the long run, we're definitely interested in using, what would be like a specialized parachain based bridge to Ethereum. I know that there is one that's at least in the beginnings of being under development. So that's certainly something where I think that is its own build a good like trust minimized bridge is like a substantive effort, right? And so that's our long-term thing. But, I think from a practical perspective, we are going to need to do something sooner. So, we are going to need to do kind of a Moonbeam specific point-to-point bridge back to Ethereum. And we are looking at a couple options for that. But that'll be something that, we'll need to do kind of in the short term until this, parachain-based bridge is available. And, that also requires then the cross-chain integration functionality on the relay chain, basically, to be able to leverage something like that.
Yeah. So where does the name Moonbeam come from, actually?
So it's from there's like an old jazz standard, like an old song called Polkadots and Moonbeams. So I think when we were brainstorming names, one of the team members knew the song and played it. I mean, it's I think that maybe a lot of people aren't familiar because it's pretty old. It's like from the the 40s. But I think that it seemed to have a nice ring to it, basically, and it kind of connected Polkadot with the name of our project. So that's the origin of the name.
Yeah. Okay. It's July 22nd, so 2 days after we landed on the moon, at least the anniversary of it.
Right.
So going down the path of the bridge and parachain versus being on Ethereum. I mean, you talk about the gas cost and everything on Ethereum. How does a parachain solution compare to other layer 2 solutions that would be available just on top of Ethereum?
Yeah, I mean, this is something that I've been spending some time learning as I've been discussing, talking to these other teams. So, obviously, this gas problem is kind of connected to just the general Ethereum scalability problem, of which there's many minds that work on finding solutions for that. One thread of execution obviously is ETH2 itself, which is pursuing a sharded model similar to the architecture of Polkadot, at least in some sense, homogeneous versus heterogeneous, but still a similar kind of parallelization idea. Obviously, a lot of projects can't wait for that. That's led to this emergence of these layer 2 solutions. There's, a whole kind of, I guess, ecosystem of these things now, right? There's different roll-up strategies. There's different plasma variants. So, I mean, I guess my take is this, that, yes, all those solutions, in some sense solve the immediate scaling problem. Though I think if you kind of squint at it a little bit, I mean, they all are, at least many of them are other chains, right? So the idea is, you have your assets on the main Ethereum base layer on layer 1, and then you move them into this, I don't think that they would use the term sidechain, but you move them into this other space, basically, that is optimized for performance. Now, so it solves kind of the scalability problem, but to me, I think it is a little bit limiting in the sense that, your kind of assets get moved into this other space, then they're inaccessible from the main layer 1. It's a different set of APIs and tools a lot of times they're using to kind of create applications that then work with the assets in this kind of separate, cul-de-sac, if you will. And, I think that our idea is kind of, we can achieve a lot of the same scalability effects, but through just kind of a multi-chain approach, right? So, by kind of thinking of your deployment as kind of spanning multiple chains, then you can, have some of your deployment be on something like Moonbeam where you can get better scalability. You're still using all the same layer 1 tools, but then, you're also kind of extending your reach out to new users and assets into Polkadot. So it's kind of it's a similar move, but I think there's other benefits, whereas when you move to one of these other scalability solutions, you're kind of just in this compartment by yourself kind of thing, right? And then, the assets aren't usable in any other way.
Yeah. So on Polkadot, what do you view the role of smart contract platforms as being? Because it is very parachain focused.
Yeah, no, I think that obviously there is this kind of space in the ecosystem for smart contracts, given the fact that smart contract functionality isn't available on the relay chain. That's intentional, right? Because you want to keep the relay chain lean and kind of push anything complicated to the edges. Is kind of, I think, the design idea, which definitely makes sense. The one question that comes up that I get sometimes is, well, I mean, Substrate itself is kind of this framework for building decentralized applications or app-specific blockchains. So, do you really even need a smart contract capability if you have Substrate? And I mean, at least our take on that is that there definitely is room for smart contracts. It's for some use cases, building a full parachain or parathread using Substrate is kind of not the right solution, right? So, I mean, it is, I think it's kind of a thing where Substrate is extremely powerful, but it also, you do take on responsibility for a lot of things, right? Organizing a set of collators that are going to support your chain, and you're kind of committing to this, at least as a parachain, to securing a slot, so there are kind of a number of things that you kind of sign up for. Whereas I think for a lot of use cases, outsourcing a lot of those elements to the platform will make sense. Where there's just a smart contract backend will kind of like make more sense. So I think that's definitely one aspect, is that there's, for some set of use cases, a smart contract backend will make sense. And given this relay chain design, then I think there's room for smart contract parachains to exist. I know there's several projects in the ecosystem that that are pursuing this idea. And I think there's just different, obviously there's different choices in how you go about implementing them, right? So I think several of the other projects are using the Substrate contracts frame palette, right, which gives you ink support, which is pretty obviously similar in the sense of smart contracts, but pretty different than kind of an Ethereum-compatible environment. So again, kind of good to have choice, kind of thing.
Yeah, and there's been there's EVM chains, but there's also WASM chains and other execution environment chains. How do you see that with just having so many different compilation targets for smart contracts, and where the EVM fits into that?
Yeah, I think for our idea, there is a little bit of an assumption. There's this multi-chain assumption, but also that Ethereum is going to continue to exist and going to be something that people will want to be kind of deploying across Ethereum and Polkadot for some foreseeable future. So what that means is, on the one hand, the EVM is obviously this I call it almost industry standard, where there's just lots of tools and other things available for it. So that's obviously part of ideas to support all those. But as Ethereum evolves, we're going to need to evolve our support too, so that it's not kind of left behind with EVM support as they move on to ETH2 and EWASM and so forth. So we do plan to kind of just maintain compatibility with whatever the current implementation technologies are in Ethereum, to allow for this just to be relevant, right, to existing projects that are deployed on Ethereum.
Yeah, and I think going back to what we were talking about with smart contracts versus building your own chain, building your own chain still requires a lot of capital and being able to actually get a parachain slot, whereas smart contracts can let people deploy their own code. So a normal parachain, you can't just let anybody deploy code on it. That's only really within the smart contracting environment. And so it's I see that as fitting in with other blockchains, because they might need to use smart contracts for something.
No, it's a good point, right? And I think I think definitely one angle is that in the spirit of this kind of specialization and kind of doing what you're good at. If we aim to be good at smart contracts, there could be kind of a use case where someone else outsources their smart contract functionality, kind of functions to us. And on the one hand, I feel so again, you have something like the Substrate contracts frame palette is something you can just add to your chain. And so maybe there's a temptation to do that. But I think it's one of those things where you can add the code, but to run a high quality smart the smart contracts implementation is not it's something that requires quite a bit of attention and kind of understanding a pretty complex set of code. So I think that a lot of people may opt for this kind of outsourcing option, insofar as that kind of makes sense, unless it's kind of core to your use case where you need to just kind of become a master of that thing.
Yeah, and it also adds some complexity. Interacting with a smart contract environment on your own chain with between the other modules is different than just interacting between two modules, right? The smart contract thing is kind of a special module in some sense. I think it'll be cool when we see, instead of an external user deploy a smart contract on a smart contract chain, but see a parachain deploy a smart contract on some smart contract chain because it wants to host some piece of logic, but doesn't want to express it in its own chain.
Yeah, we're super excited about the cross-chain integration features that are are forthcoming on Kusama and then Polkadot. So I'd say in fact that's kind of the main motivation that kind of drove us to Polkadot in the first place, is kind of that vision of being able to have chains that specialize in certain things, but then remotely access or kind of outsource kind of functionality that they don't want to focus on to other chains. I think that is a very compelling, kind of vision. So we're super excited about that. I think that, some of the ideas we have on that are that, as those functions come into play, we're quite interested in both implementing them, extending the Ethereum kind of feature set to include the ability to, leverage those features or access those features. But then even if those kind of protocols exist, our take is that there's still going to be a need to even just perform the integration and test it and kind of vet out a given integration between two chains. So there'll be value in kind of going through that process for valuable services, so Oracle services or other services that exist in Polkadot. but having those as kind of like pre-vetted and kind of available integrations that then developers can consume basically without having to worry about going through those steps themselves.
Yeah, I mean, this seems like a good time to talk about Kusama when we talk about like testing deployments. So you guys are planning to deploy parachains on both Kusama and Polkadot. And can you talk a little bit about your motivation to do that?
Yeah. I mean, I think that the idea of a canary net is basically a great idea. So, I mean, I'll go back to this, coming from this like Web 2 world. I mean, Web 3, there's a few kind of shocking differences. And I would say this kind of the way deployments happen is definitely one of them, right? So like Web 2 world, I mean, kind of the best practices, when you hire an intern, like on their first day, you make them push the deployment button to like deploy something to production so that they, get used to that. And you have hundreds of production deployments a day, like when you get to be of reasonable scale. Couldn't be more different in the blockchain space, right? I mean, I think for, obviously Polkadot has a lot of features in this area to help make it smoother, but I think for a lot of chains, like once a year might be like the standard. Pretty different, right? And then there's kind of this hand wringing kind of you only live once kind of like event that happens like leading up to the deployment, and so I think at least the idea of kind of trying to get back to some more reasonable velocity and like while maintaining quality is like a very important thing for us. And, I think we see the use, kind of Kusama and the idea of the canary net as a way to, not get all the way back to something like that, but at least start getting back into that direction, right? Where you have basically an environment you can deploy into. It has real economic conditions. It serves as like a de-risking mechanism, so that, when you have code, you deploy it there first, you let it soak there under real conditions, you try to flush out any problems, and then you can kind of promote to the mainnet. And that coupled with the on-chain governed like upgrade features, that's we believe is going to lead to higher velocity and higher quality, right? In our experience, kind of when you can do deployments faster, you get higher quality code as a result. And I think that's a pretty key competitive advantage to substrate based projects, basically, right? Just this ability to just move, right? I mean, just maintain kind of momentum and kind of like move and respond to what's happening. In my experience, from especially from the Web 2 space, this ability to move is quite important. And you can be a smaller, have larger competitors, but if you're able to kind of move faster and respond faster, you can definitely get a big competitive advantage. Yeah, the downside, is of course that you kind of duplicate everything, and that includes non-technical things. So, you're going to have like 2 tokens, and you're going to have 2 things. Although, I would say that given some of the complex mechanics that surround even kind of launching a parachain. So, for example, like the crowdfunding, like IPO functionality, and there's a lot of functionality where kind of being able to just go through those steps once in advance of kind of the mainnet is going to be extremely useful in my opinion. Now, I do think there is a downside of complexity where you kind of get this. You not only have you have 2 tokens, you have, I'd say that it becomes a little bit like confusing for users potentially, right? Where you have like 2 networks and so which one is which, and, that can be a little bit of a challenge. But, overall, I think of it this way, right? Like, a lot of the better quality projects out there, they have this concept of an incentivized testnet. And that's a thing that kind of comes into being just before you have a release, and then it like goes away. And I think it's a pretty kind of obvious next step to say like, well, why is it going away? Let's just like leave it there as a place you can deploy code, because we want to be deploying all the time. So like we don't want it to have to go re-spin it up again. Like let's just like leave it permanently.
Yeah, Kusama's been really useful, but also it is the overhead of maintaining and developing 2 networks. But it's informed so much of Polkadot's design, not just in the runtime, but like the client itself and like making sure we have good client performance. So it's kind of funny because when we talk about Kusama, we always talk about like being this experimental, like unaudited test type of thing. Shouldn't say test, but like, canary net, like chaos. And at this point, like it's been upgraded so many times that the code in Kusama has actually been heavily audited, and it's actually quite stable. Like it's almost the same code as in Polkadot now, which actually gives it like this ability to be Kusama, but for parachains, right? So like a parachain can come to Kusama and use Kusama like as it's Kusama before going to Polkadot. But it's actually very similar to Polkadot, at least now. And I think we'll see the runtimes diverge a little bit. And we want them to be like more cutting edge.
Yeah, I kind of see it as like, it's like I run like Ubuntu on my like computer, right? There's like the LTS release, and then there's like the mainline release, and there's like some set of people that just gravitate when they look. They're like, oh, well, what's the most recent LTS release, and I'm going to use that. That's me. But I think for a lot of people, they go to like whatever the latest like numbered like releases. So. And I feel like, Canonical is probably using that strategy in a similar fashion, right? They're like de-risking, kind of really, they're putting slightly more, experimental code like on the latest releases. And then they're like moving back to the more conservative, set of code like on the LTS releases.
Yeah. So like looking towards like the broader ecosystem, I mean, we have like Ethereum, Kusama, Polkadot. How do you see all these different networks actually working together?
I think this is a little bit of the trick. And, as with many things, it's like the change is like less, I mean, there is some technology pieces, but the change is more, I think, in people's minds than in changing people's minds than like in like it being a technical problem. Yeah. I mean, there's obviously kind of, you're always going to get a little bit is like this, like a tribalism, like at play, like in this space, which is also another, somewhat unusual thing, kind of coming in from the Web2 space that you notice. I mean, my hope is that, that we're drawn to the interoperability idea because, I think with interoperability between these chains in place, then it just opens choices for developers to kind of, on the one hand, specialization, but also as a developer, I can choose then to take advantage of the best that like any given chain has to offer, right? And I think, that's kind of the what we would like to see is for people to stop thinking of like, well, I'm deployed to Ethereum, or I'm deployed to Polkadot, or I'm deployed to a Substrate sovereign chain. It's more of a this kind of idea of like, where are you deployed? I mean, think about it, right? In the regular Web2 space, the applications get deployed across like Amazon. Maybe there's some local data center. Maybe there's Azure. There's different specialized components you're integrating with, and the applications kind of spread, right? You kind of use the services that you need basically to achieve the effect you want, and that's kind of, I think, what we would expect to happen, right? That's what makes sense because you can, as the developer, you just want to basically be able to assemble the services that you need, and kind of where they're located, like is something to think about, but is not like the primary driver of like, what's motivating you.
Yeah. I mean, we see that even in like the validator setups of proof of stake networks where, I mean, like literally like in one script that's like spins up AWS and Google Cloud and, all these, and Azure, all these different platforms, all these different regions to perform validation for these networks. So it does seem like a reasonable abstraction that like when it comes to the application, you could deploy it on multiple infrastructure, just like the infrastructure is deployed on multiple infrastructure.
Yeah, no, that's right. I think some key enabling technologies that probably don't exist yet is like, one would be something like Docker or some kind of way to basically take a workload and kind of abstract it. So it could be deployed in different places. So, I mean, that's something I would expect to have. I mean, I think the EVM actually is kind of like that now because it's like, but it's not obviously not designed to be that, but I think that's maybe as close as you get right now. I expect to see some further kind of development of that. And then, of course, there's, whatever like the analog of something like Terraform would be, right? Or somewhere where you could maybe even automate, some of this movement. I mean, this is pretty futuristic we're talking about now, but I think, that I mean, this kind of goes back to that kind of concept of specialization where that Substrate enables, which is that I think, there's different kinds of services that, if you kind of optimize the underlying implementation for them, that's going to like make them massively more efficient, right? So if it's long-term storage or if it's compute or if it's, whatever it is, and then being able to assemble those services, I think that's kind of a path that makes sense to follow that is kind of, analogous maybe to what I've seen in the Web2 space.
Yeah. So to start like wrapping up, have you seen anybody like building applications on Moonbeam so far?
Yeah, so I mean, I think right now we kind of achieved like our first kind of major milestone, which is just to release this Ethereum compatibility, which I was demonstrating. I think it was actually just earlier this week that you had seen. So that's 3 weeks ago or so that we achieved that milestone. We're now kind of in discussions with a number of projects, particularly some Ethereum based projects to start to test it and try it. I mean, we're still a bit early in those discussions. I don't know if I can name like many of those projects right now, but I think that's where I'm spending a lot of my personal time is basically in this kind of engagement with projects and kind of just getting our message out there, right? Because we're still a relatively small project in the big scheme of things, and aren't on people's radar yet.
Yeah, I mean, kind of going back to the beginning, like understanding your users and what kind of features you need.
No, that's right. That's right. We're already getting valuable, so even like on this hybrid deployment, I'll give you one example, right? I mean, there's different ways you can do it. I mean, do you have like an application that connects simultaneously to like, Ethereum and Moonbeam? Or do you have it where the user interface elements are like, just on Moonbeam, but there's like a backend connection back to Ethereum? There's different kind of patterns, and there's some practical things we've uncovered where, for example, MetaMask doesn't like having two Web3 providers simultaneously instantiated to two different chains. So then that kind of influences how, some constraints on how you can do things. So, we're kind of in this learning mode right now where we're learning quite a bit about what these hybrid deployments are going to look like.
That's really interesting. Like I'm excited to see how that develops, and hopefully we see you on Kusama pretty soon. Like, how is your prep going for launching your mainnet? Or, well, I guess you don't have one mainnet. You have Kusama.
Yeah, our Kusama net is the first goal. So, I mean, really, our goal is to launch that like by the end of the year. We do have, some substantive work between now and then to accomplish. The main thing we're doing now is we are working on a kind of parachain based testnet. I think most projects have kind of opted for the Substrate standalone like testnet. Our take is that parachain kind of functionality and Cumulus is there's a lot of activity happening on it now, and it's close enough where, since that's our ultimate like deployment, kind of how we're deploying our chains, we'd rather just go straight for that on our testnet. So we're working on that now. We've made progress. We expect to have that this quarter, and then we kind of march onwards towards our Kusama net as kind of the goal by the end of the year.
Yeah, I hope we see that by the end of the year. Wrap it up there. Where can people follow Moonbeam?
So I'd say on the web, we're moonbeam.network. That's a great place to start. There's a doc site that I've mentioned that is linked off of there that has a bunch of videos and other tutorials on it if you're interested in kind of learning more about Moonbeam and kind of engaging with the Ethereum compatibility features in particular. I think that's probably the best place to kind of go to find us. I mean, we're active on we have a Riot room as well for any any developers that are looking for support as they're kind of looking at the network. We're more than happy to support folks.
Yeah, or maybe Element by the time this comes out.
Sorry, Element. Excuse me. Yes, Element. That's already happened, I guess.
And I can. I read some of your docs, and I will say it's like very well written. And anybody who works with me knows that I'm a huge stickler. So I think they're really good.
Appreciate that.
Cool. We'll wrap it up there. Thanks for coming on, Derek.
All right. Well, thanks so much, Joe. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for listening to Relay Chain. We'd love to keep in touch. Follow us on Twitter at RelayChain or email podcast@parity.io. Our team at Parity includes some of the leading peer-to-peer networking developers, consensus algorithm inventors, blockchain innovators, and Rust developers. If you want to learn more about our work or want to work with us, visit our website at parity.io and sign up for our newsletter at parity.io/newsletter.